The world's great democracies, victorious in World War I, nonetheless had a hard time pushing forward in the 1920s and 30s. The European states found themselves without an important ally. The U.S. Congress had declined to join the League of Nations and had enforced a policy of isolationism. England and France were forced to reassess their own positions and that of democracy in general in world politics as a result. And then, of course, there was Central Europe. The conditions of the Treaty of Versailles had created new democracies in Eastern Europe. After the Depression hit, these new democracies also faced considerable challenges. Let's focus as a case study on Austria. In 1932, Engelbert Dollfuss came to power as chancellor. A year later, he advised the president to dismiss parliament and he took control of Austria as a dictator. Despite his authoritarianism, Dollfuss did not like Nazism. He felt that Nazism and Stalinism were very similar and argued through his propaganda that both systems had to be resisted. Unfortunately for Dollfuss, the Austrian Nazi Party was quite popular in Austria, especially in the part of Austria that bordered Germany, so he outlawed that political party. He did so in part because he worried that Adolf Hitler, newly appointed Chancellor of Germany, would seek to manipulate Austrian Nazis. Instead, Dollfuss attempted to create a government modeled on that of fascist Italy. Calling his version Austrofascism, Dollfuss established a political philosophy that, unlike Mussolini's, was strongly religious, Catholic, in nature. This conservative and religious philosophy appealed to many in Austria. He chose to cultivate a strong alliance with Italy as a result. Dollfuss's decision to outlaw Nazism simply drove it underground, however. In February of 1934, Austria was involved in a brief civil war, sometimes called the February Uprising, between pro- and anti-fascist forces. Dollfuss's party was victorious, but only barely. What Dollfuss didn't realize at that time was that the Nazis had probably helped to instigate the civil war as a way to destabilize Dollfuss's regime. While they didn't overturn it, Nazism did gain popularity, enough that, in July of 1934, 10 Austrian Nazis attempted a coup d'etat. They did not manage to overthrow Dollfuss's government, but they did assassinate Dollfuss himself. His assassination showed the sharp delineation of pro- and anti-Nazi sentiment in Austria. In general, it seemed, the military and upper classes, along with the rural working class, remained anti-Nazi, while the middle and industrial working classes were pro-Nazi. Dollfuss's family, his wife and 3 children, fled to Switzerland and were invited to Italy at the special request of Mussolini's wife. These new democracies weren't the only ones facing problems. Already facing an economic hardship before the Great Depression, the ruling Labour Party in Great Britain was forced to take drastic measures. Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, cut payments to unemployment. At this time, married women were the first to be laid off and were sometimes barred from seeking other employment. It was precisely this group of potential employees who had their unemployment payments cut, even though these women had contributed to the fund while they'd been employed. To protect domestic manufacturing, the government imposed protective tariffs, setting dues on goods at 100% of their value. All this agenda did was to discourage international trade. It did not relieve British economic problems. In 1933, the government finally began to take positive steps. A program of slum clearance was instituted, and the new building programs provided employment and infused money into the economy. In the image you see here on the screen, you can see where the slums have been cleared from places right along the riverfront. In 1936, somewhat unexpectedly, there was a new king. George VI comes to power, and George VI was a bit more liberal than his predecessors had been. Perhaps because of that, in 1938 you had the extension of the National Insurance Act, which provided minimal health benefits to 20 million workers and their families, and somewhat alleviated the cuts to unemployment. If you look quickly at the picture, you have the woman who will perhaps soon be England's longest reigning monarch. France was also in somewhat dire straits. By 1932, France had been through severe war demoralization because of all of the battles fought on French lands, and wage cuts and rising unemployment had created a country in social and political turmoil. Politically, governments were voted in and out in rapid succession, and the public was increasingly impatient with the government's limitations. Right-wing paramilitary groups gained popularity and continued with one goal: to end representative government. In February 1934, paramilitary groups joined communists and other outraged citizens gathered outside the Parliament building, chanting, "Let's string up the deputies, and if we can't string them up, let's beat in their faces, let's reduce them to a pulp." While undoubtedly frightening, the anti-representative right had little support outside of Paris, and, unlike the German or Italian versions of this movement, the French anti-republicans had no charismatic leader to mobilize the people. In 1934, demonstrations did serve to mobilize anti-fascist parties, and a coalition known as the Popular Front eventually emerged by 1935 to fight fascism and the effects of depression. Writers and intellectuals were especially drawn to coalitions like the Popular Front, as they envisioned it as a kind of cultural front to fight the rising tide of totalitarianism. In 1936-37, and again in 1938, the Popular Front gained enough electoral support to form a government with socialist leader Léon Blum as the premier. Blum extended family subsidies, state services, and welfare benefits. He appointed women to his government, although they didn't have the right to vote, and guaranteed workers 2-week paid vacations, a 40-hour work week, and the right to collective bargaining. The Popular Front was often characterized by a youthful and democratic culture. One man recalled that, in 1936, everyone was 20 years old. Cities and towns organized local cultural centers for activities such as popular theater. Citizens celebrated holidays like Bastille Day with greater fervency as a bastion against fascism. However, the Popular Front governments were politically weak. Bankers and industrialists, dissatisfied with the strong pro-employee policies of these governments, had invested their money outside of the country, leaving France financially strapped. Worried about the state of the economy under communists and socialists, the upper classes, always tending towards more conservative governments, began using the phrase, "better Hitler than Blum." Blum tried to rectify the situation by reducing taxes for the wealthy, which inevitably left the burden of government to the lower classes. While revitalizing France, Blum's governments lost credibility when he refused to get involved in the fight against fascism abroad, most notably in one of Europe's newest republics, Spain. In 1931, fed up with the inadequacies of the monarchy, Spain overthrew its monarch and created a republic. Republicans hoped to modernize Spain through the promotion of industry and efficient farming, which entailed the confiscation of property and demilitarization. This prompted the immediate opposition to form. These right-wing forces, referred to as the Nationalists or the Falange Party, comprised landowners, clergy, and military leaders who were upset at being shut out of the parliamentary process. In 1936, Republican forces temporarily banded together in a Popular Front coalition to win elections and to prevent the collapse of the Republic. The front was victorious, but the Nationalists quickly recovered under the leadership of Francisco Franco, and a war had begun. During the war, the Republicans found it easy to control the commercial and industrial centers of Madrid and the rest of southeastern Spain, but the Nationalists quickly took control of the rest of the country. In response to the goals of the fascist phalanges, both Hitler and Mussolini sent aid to Franco's forces, while Stalin tried, for a time, to support the Republican forces, which boasted a few communists. While the Republican government appealed elsewhere for help, that help was not forthcoming. Stalin removed his troops in 1938, while Great Britain and France refused to support the Republican government of Spain, despite the outpouring of public support for the democratic cause in their individual countries. Some volunteers from these countries, and especially anti-Mussolini exiles from Italy, thought of Spain as the place to stop fascism. But they were much less well supplied than the fascists, and they splintered into competing groups of liberals, Trotskyites, anarchists, and communists. In March of 1939, Franco completed his defeat of the Republicans and created a fascist dictatorship in Spain. The Great Depression had caused political and economic stagnation in European republics like Great Britain and France, and had brought about the rise of totalitarian dictatorships in former republics like Germany and Spain. It had seemed as though there were only two options for dealing with depression: sticking with the government and muddling through the depression, or radically reconstituting the government and attacking the depression head-on. As it turned out, though, there was a third option, a viable middle way that Sweden chose. This tactic involved sticking with their government, but reconceiving the government's role in promoting social welfare and economic democracy. Sweden had been neutral during the Great War and had profited from war trade, but had also suffered from the inflation and ensuing depression of the 1920s, as well as from population decline. In fact, if you look at this picture of a bunch of kids, they're at a birthday party and they're dressed up as soldiers in World War I. Isn't that an interesting thing to do? In response to this decline, the Swedish government instituted central planning of the economy and social welfare programs, with a system that seemed similar in some ways to that of the Soviet Union. The government devalued Swedish currency to make it more attractive on the international market, and they used government expenditures to maintain consumer spending and encourage modernization. As a result, Swedish productivity rose 20% in the early 1930s, while other democracies experienced declines. Part of that central planning, with the devaluation of the currency, at least as relates to gold, made Swedish goods cheaper on the foreign markets, and that was hugely important. Economically speaking, we call this government impulse to motivate the economy pump priming, and this is precisely what Sweden did in the 1920s and early 1930s. To address the population decline, Alva Myrdal, a social scientist and member of parliament, helped develop a plan that promoted voluntary parenthood. This system would look similar to that of Hitler's in Germany. Her plan allowed for a loan program for married couples, introduced prenatal care for pregnant women, allowed for free childbirth in hospital for those couples, provided food relief for families, and subsidized housing for large families. And by the end of the 1930s, almost 50% of all mothers received government aid. More importantly, Sweden's birth rate had begun to increase, as you can see in the image below. By the late 1930s, it was obvious that some governments, primarily the totalitarian regimes, were preparing for war. At first, many ordinary citizens and statesmen in Britain and France assumed that the League of Nations could take care of the threat. Others believed that Hitler and Mussolini should be appeased. They believed that the world had rushed into the Great War and that more caution was required this time around. In any case, you know and I know that the road to war was probably inevitable in the 1930s. This has led some modern historians to characterize the years between 1914 and 1945 as a modern 30 Years' War. Now, as you know, Hitler and Mussolini also felt that their countries were have-nots, that they'd been limited by the post-Great War agreements in such a way that they felt they could only right that wrong through permanent conflict. Hitler's agenda included much expansion. He advocated the annexation of the Rhineland and the annexation of other territories occupied by ethnic Germans. Aryans, he believed, needed Lebensraum, living space, in order to thrive. Hitler was merely trying to make this space available. Others living on those territories, ethnic Slavs and Bolsheviks, would be transferred to Siberia or enslaved by the superior race. Like Hitler, Mussolini described himself as a peace-loving man who had to resort to extreme measures so as to benefit not only his country, but all of humanity as well. In the autumn of 1933, Hitler announced the withdrawal of Germany from the League of Nations. A year and a half later, in 1935, Hitler rejected the clauses of the Treaty of Versailles that limited German military expansion, and he reintroduced military conscription and public armament. He also began building the Autobahn. Nobody really knew what it was for at the time, but eventually, of course, it was clear. This was to make military movement easy across Germany. In 1935, Mussolini too chose action. Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent countries left in Africa. The invasion was meant to reassert Italian power and demonstrate his capabilities to an Italian audience. One soldier commented that, "The Roman legionnaires are again on the march." Although Ethiopia resisted, the country was no match for the Italian military, and the longest-running dynasty in the world, one with roots back to the Queen of Sheba of biblical fame, ended. The League of Nations voted sanctions against Italy for its actions, but Britain and France both opposed an embargo against Italy, which kept the sanctions from being effective. Still, the imposition of sanctions infuriated Mussolini. In the meantime, Hitler took advantage of Europe's preoccupation with Italy to invade the supposedly permanently demilitarized Rhineland in 1936. Ethnic Germans greeted the invasion with enthusiasm, while France protested the move to the League of Nations. The British, however, greeted the news of the invasion as an irreversible maneuver, which left the French unable to sustain an attack on Germany on their own. As a result, both Mussolini and Hitler appeared as powerful military leaders. After the official announcement of a treaty of friendship between Germany and Italy in October 1936, Mussolini boasted of a Rome-Berlin axis around which, presumably, the rest of the world would rotate. of course, Hitler was nowhere near done. In March of 1938, while the Austrian chancellor sought to maintain independence from Germany by allowing the Austrian people to vote over whether or not to accept Anschluss, or union, with Germany, Hitler invaded Austria. He apparently feared losing the referendum. The Austrians seemed to welcome Hitler. It was obvious that, by and large, Austrians supported the idea of Anschluss, especially those in the West. Austria was declared a German province, Ostmark. Hitler now turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. The new republic had good resources that had once been German. However, the Czechs were not at all eager to join Hitler's growing empire. Moreover, the country had a large army, formidable defenses, and Hitler understood that, unlike the Austrians, the Czechs were prepared to fight for their independence. Hitler gambled, correctly, that the West would be largely uninterested in Hitler's planned conquest of Czechoslovakia. Most Western intellectuals felt that the creation of Czechoslovakia had denied the peoples of that area the right to self-determination. And so, during the spring and summer of 1938, Hitler poured propaganda into the country. He also worked to convince Czech neighbors, Hungary and Poland, that they had something to gain from Czechoslovakia's breakup. Hungary, already a German ally, bought into the plan. Poland did not. Hitler warned Czechoslovakia that it would have to grant autonomy to its German-populated borders, known as the Sudetenland, by October of 1938 or face German invasion. As the deadline approached, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain organized a meeting with Hitler. He was joined by Mussolini and French Premier Édouard Daladier in Munich. Britain agreed not to oppose Germany's claim to the Sudetenland, and Hitler ended the Munich conference by signing an agreement that Germany would never go to war with Great Britain. This was known as the Munich Pact. The strategy of appeasement, preventing a war by making concessions for legitimate grievances, in this case the alleged affront to the Germans in the Peace of Paris, was widely seen as a positive act, the result of diplomacy, not violence. Despite that, there were some leaders who felt that you were granting Hitler control of a formerly independent republic, and that was never a good thing. As you might imagine, the Czech ambassador to Germany reportedly wept at the outcome of the conference, while Stalin pondered the fact that the West was apparently unwilling to fight for the independence of Eastern European democracies. While the repression within German borders was not a surprise to Germans, the rest of the world was nonetheless taken aback when, in November of 1938, just a couple of months after supposedly settling for peace, you have the outbreak of Kristallnacht, the night when innumerable Jewish buildings, houses of worship, businesses were destroyed. The lesson of Kristallnacht should have been to keep a closer eye on Germany, but in reality it was already too little too late. By early 1939, Hitler was disgruntled that his agreement with the Munich Conference had put a stop to his plans for the full invasion of Czechoslovakia. Since he'd managed to portray himself as a man of peace, he spent the next few months biding his time. In March of 1939, he finally sent German troops over the border into the Sudetenland. In response, Britain and France pledged military support to Poland, Romania, Greece, and Turkey in case of a Nazi invasion. In May of 1939, Hitler and Mussolini countered this agreement by signing a pledge of offensive and defensive support, the Pact of Steel. Now, the pact was originally supposed to include Japan as well, but Japan protested the fact that the focus of the pact was on Britain and France and not on the Soviet Union, and backed out of signing at the last minute. This pact was signed with the idea that the war would not occur within the following 3 years, oops, and that it would last 10 years as a pact, another oops. While the Munich Pact is often criticized by modern historians, at the time, since there was almost no support for war in the Western democracies, it was hailed as revolutionary. Even the statesmen who thought Hitler mad, and there were many, felt that his own love and concern for his country would lead him to rational solutions in dealing with Germany's just claims after the Treaty of Versailles. Still, even the most fervent supporters of the Munich Pact were forced to reassess their position when, on August 23, 1939, Germany and the USSR signed a non-aggression agreement. The Nazi-Soviet Pact astonished the West. After all, Hitler vowed to eradicate the Bolsheviks, and the Soviets had officially come out against fascism. What the West didn't realize was that Stalin needed time to reconstitute his military because he had, of course, destroyed his military corps through his purges. As the pact promised neutrality in case of war, it meant that the Soviet Union would not have to worry about its western border. In addition, Germany would not have to worry about an invasion on its eastern front. After all, the Schlieffen Plan had not worked in World War I. In addition, the two countries made a secret agreement to divide Poland and the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, between themselves. Hitler would claim western Poland while Stalin could annex the eastern part of the country and the Baltic states. When Hitler aimed his forces at Poland, it seems that he was genuinely convinced that he would meet no outside interference. The Western powers had viewed the Munich Pact as a great act of diplomacy, and the appeasement therein was meant to alleviate hurt German pride after the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler had interpreted the document in another way. He felt that it was, in essence, carte blanche, that the West had essentially bowed out gracefully from any intervention in Eastern Europe. Hitler's focus on Poland had begun with a demand that the Poles return to him the free city of Danzig and yield the territory referred to as the Polish Corridor, a strip of land to connect East Prussia to the rest of Germany. Hitler had couched his demand in nationalistic terms, insisting that Germans in Polish territory were in danger. Privately, he admitted freely that he needed an alibi, a way to rally the German people around a full-scale invasion of a sovereign country that in no way wished to unite with Germany. Despite Hitler's rhetoric, it seems that there was no jubilation in Berlin on September 1, 1939, the day of the invasion of Poland, nor was there any lightening of the mood when Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. Clearly, the Munich Pact had failed. This was of grave concern to Britain, which had, just previously to the signing of the Munich Pact, predicted that a new global war would produce 1.8 million casualties, and that London would most likely be bombed daily by as much as 700 tons of bombs. Of course, that wasn't Hitler's concern. German ground forces quickly defeated the ill-equipped Polish army by launching their Blitzkrieg, a new, decidedly 20th century war strategy in which the Germans concentrated airplanes, tanks, and motorized infantry to encircle the enemy. The German Blitzkrieg overwhelmed Warsaw, quickly completing the German invasion of Poland. The rapid pace of the conquest ensured Germans at home that the human and material costs of obtaining Lebensraum would be low. Many of them became supporters of Hitler's war effort after this fact. On September 17th, the Soviets invaded the eastern part of Poland to make their own conquest as per the Nazi-Soviet pact. Having thus divided the conquered territory, Hitler issued a peace initiative in October so that future clashes between Nazis and the Poles, or the Soviets and the Baltic states, would seem like the fault of the former democracies. Britain's and France's refusal to negotiate for peace after having declared war allowed Hitler to sell the war to Germans as one of self-defense. Hadn't he been willing to negotiate for peace in Poland? Now it was the Western powers who refused peace. Hitler's propaganda machine went to work characterizing now militant Britain and France as the warlike menace of the world's Jewry. In the meantime, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, intending to add it, too, to its store of new territories. The League of Nations accordingly expelled the Soviet Union. Happy with his victory, Hitler planned an attack on France for November, but his generals, fearing that Germany was unprepared for total war, convinced him to postpone the offensive until the spring. The months between November and April became known as the Phony War, with the combatants engaged in little direct conflict. The relative peace lulled the Western powers into complacency. They were unprepared for Hitler's next move. In April of 1940, the Blitzkrieg crushed both Denmark and Norway, with the battles of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France following that May and June. In France, panic and defeatism ensued. On June 5th, Mussolini invaded France from the southeast, and to the shock of the rest of the world, much of the French defense collapsed. The British forces were unable to aid France. They were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk in northern France, where, eventually, 370,000 British and French soldiers were rescued by an improvised fleet of naval ships, fishing boats, and pleasure craft. The French government surrendered on the 22nd of June, leaving Germany to rule the northern half of the country, which included Paris. In the south, known as Vichy France in honor of the new capital, the conservative and aged World War I hero, Henri-Philippe Pétain, was allowed to govern. Meanwhile, Stalin used a diversion in Western Europe to officially annex the Baltic states and to seize Bessarabia and Bukovina from Romania. Horrified at the speed of the German onslaught, the British populace was more than ready to blame Neville Chamberlain for it. Chamberlain resigned as prime minister, and his party, the Conservatives, chose a new prime minister, Winston Churchill, a man who had been an early advocate of resistance to Hitler. Chamberlain, however, remained a well-regarded member of Parliament and even served in Churchill's war cabinet until his death from cancer 6 months later. In the summer of 1940, Hitler proved one of the British predictions true. He ordered the bombardment of Britain, called the Battle of Britain, or the Blitz. His goal was to so disable British defenses that the country would be unable to defend against a naval invasion. Operating via radio, Churchill rallied the British. More than 9 million British homes boasted that technology by 1940, and he worked to reverse the pacifist spirit fostered under Chamberlain. He announced that sacrifice would be expected so as to protect the ideals of liberty. This, he claimed, would be Britain's finest hour. He promised nothing, no victory, no relief, except for blood, toil, tears, and sweat. In the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe bombed public buildings and monuments, harbors, and suspected weapons depots, military bases, and industrial areas. The British, however, refused to negotiate, laughing at German demands that they surrender, and instead used the enormous wealth of their colonies to research anti-aircraft weapons, to develop the highly successful code-detecting group called Ultra, and to develop an advantage in radar, which had been developed and perfected throughout the 1930s. By the end of 1940, Britain was outproducing Germany by 50%, and their Royal Air Force, the RAF, was winning against the Luftwaffe. By the fall of 1940, German air losses forced them to abandon the Battle of Britain. Hitler settled for attacking British bases in the Mediterranean, Middle East, and South Africa. He also expanded his alliance system. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria joined the Axis powers. While these new alliances gained Germany more access to food and oil, he wasn't done. Continuing in this vein, Hitler formally signed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Japan, and a later non-aggression pact with Turkey. And then it was spring, 1941. By this time, Hitler felt prepared enough to attack what he called the center of Judeo-Bolshevism, the Soviet Union. This decision, more than any other, would bring about his downfall. In June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, named after the famous Holy Roman Emperor of the Second and unsuccessful Crusade, began when the German army crossed the Soviet border. Hitler declared himself happy to be delivered from the torment of allying with Bolsheviks, promising to raze Moscow and Leningrad to the ground. Deployed along a 2,000-mile eastern front, 3 million German and other Axis troops quickly penetrated the Soviet border. Upon hearing of the German invasion, Stalin chose to disappear for a few days before reappearing to rally the Soviet defense. By July, however, the German army had come within 200 miles of Moscow and would eventually come to reach its suburbs. Now, if that map looks familiar, it should. What you see there, on the left, is the invasion of Russia by the Nazis in 1941. What you see on the right is Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. Isn't it eerie how similar they are? Of course, Hitler had better success than Napoleon. Using the strategy of rapid encirclement, German troops had killed, captured, and wounded more than half of Stalin's 4.5 million soldiers stationed along the border. Perhaps drunk on his amazing success, Hitler proposed the attacks on Leningrad, the Baltic states, and the Ukraine simultaneously, against the advice of his generals, who preferred to focus on Moscow. The execution of Hitler's plan was cumbersome. German troops were bogged down by the autumn rains, and throughout the winter of 1941-42, the Soviet people began to fight back. Hitler's armies found themselves facing a situation not unlike that faced by Napoleon over a century before. The cold temperatures not only weakened the German forces, but the severe weather had a horrific effect on 20th century weaponry. Oil and gasoline froze, preventing the Germans from using their artillery and cavalry. Nonetheless, Hitler feared devoting more of his resources to the troops along the Soviet front. He didn't want to give the impression that the Blitzkrieg had run its course, or that Operation Barbarossa would devolve into a prolonged campaign, both of which, incidentally, were already true. So he, in essence, did little to nothing to alleviate the suffering of his troops along the Eastern Front. Here are another two strikingly similar images. You have the Germans in the winter of 41-42, and you have Napoleon's forces on their retreat from Moscow. Isn't it amazing how lessons weren't learned? In fact, perhaps some of the French soldiers would have echoed the words of a later German soldier who wrote in his diary that winter, "What is this all for? When will we ever get back home?" In December of 1941, as the German army was, unknowingly, settling in for a long campaign in the Soviet Union, the Japanese attacked the American naval and air bases at Pearl Harbor, and then proceeded to damage a fleet of airplanes in the Philippines. These actions prompted the United States to declare war on Japan and intensify the U.S.-Japanese competition in the Pacific. On December 11th, Hitler, faithful to the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the U.S., and Mussolini followed suit. The U.S. was in no way prepared for a prolonged war, but the situation inclined the American public towards a war effort. After the German and Italian declarations of war against the U.S., Germany's four strongest enemies, the U.S., Great Britain, the Free French, an exile government led by General Charles de Gaulle and based in London, and the Soviet Union, joined to form the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance, or the Allies, together with an even larger alliance comprised of 20 other countries, was forced to overcome internal strife so as to deal effectively with the Axis menace. Even more than World War I, the Second World War depended on industrial productivity geared toward total war and, in Germany, mass murder. Despite their vast conquests, the Axis powers were at a disadvantage throughout the war. Although the war effort had accelerated economic production some 300% between 1940 and 1944, the Allied countries produced twice as many armaments as the Axis powers in 1941 and more than 3 times as many in 1943. The Soviet Union, by itself, increased its production of aircraft by 40% between 1942 and 43. By 1943, it was also turning out 2,000 tanks per month. The Axis powers were also at a disadvantage because of their campaign promises. Hitler had come to power because of his promise to alleviate economic suffering. Requiring expansive war rationing would have undercut his popularity, so he depended, perhaps too heavily, on blitzkrieg, which made the most of human soldiers and few supplies. While the use of slave labor from occupied territories had temporarily alleviated economic devastation in Germany, the prolonged campaign in the Soviet Union meant that supplies and resources had to be rerouted. Axis powers had also committed another error during the 1920s and 30s. In committing to the traditional ideology of women in the private sphere, at home, they had discouraged women from seeking work in factories. As a result, women avoided paid work in factories even during wartime, although workers were desperately needed in offices and factories. By contrast, Allied powers encouraged women to take the factory positions left empty by men heading off to war. By the end of the war, women comprised more than half of the Soviet workforce. They were hired to build anti-tank trenches around Moscow and other cities, and 800,000 of them volunteered for the military, some of them even serving as pilots in the Air Force. Stalin worked to encourage the revival of Russian nationalism, which had been oppressed in favor of communist ideology, and he even allowed religious services because the Orthodox Church served as a rallying point for the people. The Allies went into overdrive regarding propaganda, and this time they had a fantastic new media, film. Government agencies monitored filmmaking and allocated supplies to films with approved patriotic and pro-war messages. In the United States, the military loaned authentic props in exchange for the censoring of scripts. Even advertisers got into the action. One advertisement read, "If your dealer doesn't have your favorite lifesavers, please be patient. It's because the shipment he would have received has gone to the Army and Navy." A big part of propaganda was meant to demonizing the enemy. Anti-ethnic or anti-racial characterizations were a part of the war effort. Between the war years, people lost much of their privacy as governments monitored and organized many aspects of everyday life in an effort to devote as many resources as possible to total war. In England in 1943, the wartime Ministry of Food employed 39,000 people to manage what other people ate. Propaganda encouraged women and children to endure deprivation so that the men on the front could have what they needed. While it's true that it was ultimately professional armies who defeated the Axis powers, it is also true that civilian resistance in Nazi-occupied territory contributed to the Allied triumph. The Free French government, for instance, led forces comprised of 20% colonized Asians and Africans. Other French forces fought in communist-dominated groups against Nazis in France itself. The Polish resistance was organized against the Nazis and fought within cities, and in Yugoslavia, Serbs and Croats, who traditionally attacked each other, joined under the leadership of Josip Broz or Marshal Tito. Other resistance fighters were less organized. Housewives circulated letters detailing demonstrations at prisons or marketplaces. Hikers helped to smuggle Jews and others through dangerous mountain passes. Danish villagers created vast escape passes. Women were often the carriers of assassination weapons, correctly assuming that they were much less likely to be searched. Resistance measures were even visible in Germany and Italy. Couples began to restrict the size of their families in defiance of pro-birth policies, and teenagers danced the forbidden American jitterbug in secret clubs. The Allies began tightening the noose around the Axis powers in mid-1942. A major turning point came in August of that year when the German army began a siege on Stalingrad, whose capture was expected to yield access to oil and the country's interior. However, months of fighting led to house-to-house combat, each side refusing to surrender. Finally, using the German tactic of encirclement, the Soviet army besieged and then captured the 90,000 German survivors in February of 1943. Meanwhile, the British had managed to hold their own against the Germans in North Africa, and with the United States invaded Morocco and Algeria in the autumn of 1942. North Africa was divided by Italian troops led by a German, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty. In July of 1943, the Allies having pretty much taken back North Africa, Allied forces landed in Sicily, hoping for a quick victory over Italy as the king, Victor Emmanuel III, obligingly ousted Mussolini from his position as prime minister and ordered his arrest. Mussolini, though, escaped with the aid of Nazi and Italian conspirators and fled to northern Italy, where German troops engaged the Allies in a fierce battle for the peninsula. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad began the costly Soviet drive westward, during which the Soviets faced the brunt of the Nazi war effort. In December of 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Tehran, Iran, to agree on the opening of a Western European front for which Stalin had been pressing and which Churchill had been resisting. On the 6th of June 1944, the combined Allied forces under the command of American Dwight D. Eisenhower reached the fortified French Normandy coast. The Nazis had been deceived into focusing their forces to the north. Still, there were plenty defenders in place to attempt to defeat the Allies. The Allies, however, eventually gained the beach and forced their way into France as their air force bombarded the German-held cities of western France. In late July, Allied forces broke through German defenses, and a month later, Paris was liberated. The Allied forces then pushed eastward, hoping to squeeze the Third Reich between its western and eastern fronts. In 1944, Soviet armies entered Poland, pausing only long enough to allow the Germans to set down a Polish rebellion. Since the Soviet Union intended to keep Poland, this was to their benefit, and they continued on into Hungary. In July of 44, a group of German military officers, fearing their country's military humiliation again, attempted to assassinate Hitler by exploding a bomb at a meeting. The Führer was, however, only slightly wounded, and he wreaked his revenge on the conspirators, one of whom, Klaus von Stauffenberg, had an entire movie made about him. Hitler refused to admit defeat. Driven by his own ideology, he concluded that the Germans were proving themselves unfit and unworthy of his greatness, and that they deserved to perish in a great cataclysmic conflagration. Accordingly, he refused all negotiations which might have spared the Germans further death and destruction. However, he had a brief respite. In December of 1944, Nazi forces temporarily got behind the Allied forces and engaged them in what would be the last land battle of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. However, it was a short-lived victory. By the end of April of 1945, the Allies had managed to liberate Italy, and they were moving northward into Germany. Mussolini, who had stayed with the German forces in northern Italy, was discovered by the Italians, and they dragged him out. They did not intend for him to have a fair trial, and in fact, Mussolini and his mistress were shot by partisans, and then their bodies were hanged for public display. Hitler's refusal to surrender led to the bombing of Germany and, in 1945, the invasion of Germany by the Soviet Union. As Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin, Hitler committed suicide with his wife, Eva Braun. Their bodies were burned in the courtyard of the German Chancellery. Although many soldiers remained committed to the Third Reich, Germany finally surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. Japan, of course, would surrender later that summer. As was the case with the Great War, the end of fighting did not signal the end of warfare. And in fact, it was only after the fighting had concluded that the Allies came to a realization of how vast the Nazi genocide had been against various groups within the German territories. And it was that aftermath that hugely impacted the world going forward in terms of policies and procedures for dealing with the aftermath of war. But that is a story for another day.